I love that music. It's so fun. Welcome, everyone. I know, let's put on our dance moves. We are here with Book Club Live, and we're thrilled to welcome Eden Royce, author of Root Magic. Welcome, welcome. Yes, round of applause. And of
Thank
course,
you
we're
so much
also
for inviting me.
yeah, thank you so much. And we are even being joined from like all different time zones. So it's especially cool that Eden was able to join us. And we also have Adriana Cuevas and Jacqueline West of our spooky middle grade team here to ask all of our burning questions. So we have a lot. I have a whole huge list of questions here for Eden.
Get ready,
But we're
Eden.
yes, get ready, get ready. We're also going to be taking live questions. So if people out there have questions that they want to ask Eden, get those in the chat. But I'm going to start out with my first question. And that is, so you've published a lot of things, short stories for adults and other types of fiction, but this is your first book for children. So how has that process, writing for children, been different than writing for adults?
Well, it is my first novel, full stop, but it's also the first thing that I've ever written for a younger audience. I don't think that the process was necessarily super different, but the thing that I did find um, a little bit unusual for me is plotting and planning and trying to put in a message that was directly for younger audiences. So I think the whole planning and plotting and structure and all that good stuff um, of coming up with a story idea and characters, all of that was the same. But just trying to focus in and speak directly to a middle grade audience was really the only major difference for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm already going off script, but so did you kind of put yourself in the head of like you at that age? I know that's something usually when I'm writing, I'll kind of think back and be like, what was I doing when I was like 9 or 10 or 11? How would I have seen this situation? Are you kind of writing for yourself at that age, or do you have a different audience in mind?
I'm definitely writing for myself at that age because I really didn't have a lot of books when I was 9, 10, 11 years old that reflected not only Black characters being the heroes of the story, but also books that were set in the American South, where there was sort of magic plus mystery and adventure. And I didn't read a lot of those growing up, and I always wanted to. So I took, I think it's Toni Morrison's advice. If there is a book that you want to read but hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So that's the birth of Root Magic.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's so, short fiction, though, is so hard. Like you mentioned, this is your very first novel, but I think doing it short and having to condense it all down into that, like, tiny, tiny little capsule is super hard. Did you feel like that was really helpful? Like all that training you got on doing short fiction when it came time to move into novels?
I actually find writing novels harder than short stories. Um, just the idea of moving from a piece of work that is, for me, tellable in 5,000 words to writing 50,000 plus words, same characters and the same topics. I thought, how in the world do people do this? Um, so writing a novel just seemed like this massive thing that was something that other people did. I'm a short story writer. I don't really write novels, but when I looked at the characters, the Turner family, they needed more time and they needed more space to have everything happen that I wanted to happen. So I had to sort of bite the bullet and realize that I had to embrace a longer form of work. And I resisted it for ages, but I finally realized, okay, fine, it has to be a novel. It's just, I'm going to have to spend the time to put it together. But I originally wrote it in short stories. And
Oh,
then
wow.
because I just felt like the idea of just writing a novel start to finish was just a huge project. And I just broke it down into individual short stories and wrote all of those. And then I went back and wrote in things to connect the short stories, different scenes and um, transition moments to connect the stories into one full narrative.
That makes me
Wow,
want
that's
to
really
read the book all over again now that I know that. Seriously, because what I absolutely loved about it, and I think what is a plus for you as a short story writer is that I have a super short attention span, so I like shorter middle grade, and then I also like middle grade that moves at a pretty good pace. And I felt that that was one of the amazing things about Root Magic. But now that I know that it's technically composed of short stories, I really want to go back now and see if I can like pull out what I think the short stories are. That's awesome. I love that.
It was the only way I thought I could tackle it. I've obviously done lots of edits and all of that after the original short story set. But let me know what you think if you decide to go back to it.
Yeah, that's very cool. It's kind of inspiring too for people who may be daunted by the idea of doing a novel because it is such a large thing. And I know I still feel like it's impossible to hold all of the pieces of a novel in your head at one time. So knowing that you can break it down into these different kind of sections or little short stories and then go back and connect them like that is really cool. And I think it could be inspiring for people who are starting out. Have you kind of found that, like, I mean, you mentioned like short fiction, and it sounds like for you was kind of an end in and of itself. Like it wasn't necessarily a gateway into like publishing longer fiction, but do you think that that would be a good thing for younger writers to explore, maybe going into short fiction first and leading into novels that way?
I think that it's a good way to start to learn the industry. But obviously, you can talk to 10 different people and they'll have 10 different experiences as to how they became a writer. And lots of people decide they want to go different routes and try different things. And you may actually have to try multiple things in order to find the place that you want to be. But for me, I've always loved short fiction. Moving from some of the earliest things that I read when I was younger, obviously those books at the time were shorter. And then I discovered lots of short fiction that was more of dark short fiction. Shirley Jackson, Daphne du Maurier, obviously some Poe as well. And I just loved being able to read something that was start to finish such an inclusive tale in an abbreviated space. And I was just always fascinated by that. And I know that there are some people that don't care for the short story form, but it is, I think, different than writing a novel. The approach to it is different. And I think that it can teach you in a smaller space how to characterize the people in your story, how to set a tone in your story. So there are lots of things that give you just a sort of snippet of what needs to be done over a longer work without having to spend 50, 60, 70,000 words in order to feel confident with what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way, I feel like, to hone in on one specific thing because you can only do so much within a short story. So you kind of have to really focus on like, that one thing for that story. And that's really cool. It's like a master class in all the skills it takes to write. I know Jacqueline has some questions that she's dying to get in. So let me turn it over to her.
It's true. When we were compiling, I had a whole bunch. So I loved the book. It's absolutely beautiful. I'd love to hear more about what your research process for the book was like. As you mentioned, in the text itself, this is something that tends to be taught by, word of mouth instead of through written word. And so in that case, did you do lots of interviews with relatives and family? Did you have to travel home? Did you talk to current practitioners of root work? What was the process like for you in this case?
I don't know that I would even really go so far as to call it research. A lot of the story ideas came from tales that I'd heard growing up from family members. And I try really hard to write in isolation, so to speak, and not really share what I'm writing until I feel like it's reached a level of completion. So I thought about these stories. I did have some conversations with my mom, but I didn't do any real traveling. I live here in the UK now. And when I first started writing these short stories, I was living here, but I had such a wonderful recall of where I'm from, and being able to remember those stories that I heard was really the impetus for a lot of root magic. So, and I just happen to know people that are root workers. So, just in checking in on friends and asking how people are doing, just hearing the things that they're doing now and realizing that those are still traditions that I remember from growing up, where it was just sort of reinforcement that I was on the right path. So I didn't even let anyone read it or anything like that until it was finished. But even though I'm a Geechee, I wanted to still go through the process of having a sensitivity reader because I think that's an important thing to do. So I reached out to Sarah Makiba Days, who is an incredible writer in her own right, but is also a cultural historian and archivist. And I asked if she would read the book before it went to print and tell me what she thought I got right, what she thought I got wrong, what was almost there, and whatever have you. But at the end of it, my mom got an ARC of it, and just hearing her excitement about it, I felt like I'd gotten something right, even though I didn't do tons of research. It was just basically memories on a page.
Well,
Jacqueline, can I jump in with the question?
go ahead.
Sure.
So this is the first book or middle grade book, or really any book that I've read that addresses root magic. So what I was wondering when I read it, because this happens to me writing Cuban American characters, you kind of feel this burden of your culture that you are representing it. And like you said, you want to get it right. And so I was wondering, like, if you could talk about, I guess, any pressure you might have felt knowing that for a lot of readers, this was going to be their first and perhaps their only exposure to root work. And so how did that affect your writing process? And did you struggle a little bit with that? Because I know that's something that I always end up going through.
Definitely. It's one of those things where, whether it's right or not, you do feel that pressure and you do feel that burden. I think not telling people early on in the process what you're writing about kind of helps that. And I had to learn that early on in my career doing short stories. Just as difficult as it is, and as much as I would want to share ideas that I'm working on, I try really hard to sort of keep everything internalized. But I find that with all of my writing, really. And I had to come to a point of I'm presenting a fictionalized story, even though there are events that are historically accurate and they were fact checked to the nth degree. But a lot of that is wrapped up in a fictionalized story, and I have to let people know that, and I have to sort of internalize that myself. There was, at the time when I was sort of putting ideas for root magic together, and I had little bits and pieces of notes, there was a short story that I wrote. It's an adult market short story, but it's called Sweetgrass Blood. And it sort of reflects my feelings at the time and still now. And there's two characters in the story. And one is called the poet, who writes about her culture. And the other is the weaver, who's like an ancestor spirit who is not too happy with it. And they just sort of butt heads. And I won't tell you the outcome of the story, but there is a follow-up to the story as well, called Folk, which both of which are online to read free if you'd like to do that. But it's this sort of push and pull between, do you want to put your culture on the page, knowing that people tend to usurp culture for their own purposes, and portray it in potentially negative ways, versus I want to be as authentic about myself, about the people that I'm from, the place that I'm from as possible. So there's always that extra worry and burden about getting it right, so to speak. So, absolutely. And I'm not sure that that ever necessarily goes away completely, but I think you have to know that you're bringing the best story that you can at the time to the page. And a lot of times things change in editing and copy edits and all of that. And you have to get to a point where you're willing to say, I see your point with wanting to change this, but I'm afraid that this needs to stay the way it is. It is more authentic to what I'm trying to portray.
I need
Yeah,
to read those short stories now too. That sounds amazing. I love that.
I know. We'll have to link in the description to where people can find those. That would be awesome. And yes, Jacqueline, we'll go back to you for your other questions. I just had another question that popped into my head, and then of course it just flew out of my brain as I was getting ready to ask it. So we will get back to Jacqueline.
I know I'm wanting to go off script too, because as you were talking, I realized also how much I loved the use of setting, how complete. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about any book, where the world contained within it feels so real. And you did that with both the era and the place. I mean, just the listing of the crops that are grown around the home, and the animals that are part of this, the world around these children. And I wondered, now that you're living in the UK instead of within this setting yourself, does that change sort of the lens you feel? Did it in a way make you want to write more about what feels like home, or has it given you a different perspective? I know Neil Gaiman, who kind of did the opposite, moved from the UK to the American Midwest, has said that's really what changed his perspective on everything. Being sort of feeling like an outsider in a place that's not your home gives you a different kind of lens on what was home. Do you feel that in your work?
I don't think so. I think most of what I've written and have written is firmly based in the American South with Southern characters. And it's part of what I like to do is put Black Southern characters on the page, especially from a speculative fiction point of view, because a lot of times we're either portrayed negatively, not portrayed at all, especially in the Southern Gothic genre, which doesn't have many Black or brown writers, full stop. So I really feel like putting not only the culture where I'm from, but a lot of the tonality and mores of the South in my work, because it is just sort of innate to me. And I want to reflect characters that do feel like home to me, because the South never leaves you. It is always a part of how I write and what I write and the people that I write about.
Absolutely. And we have Chapter 11 Studios, who's popping in to see how much they loved Root Magic.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful.
Excellent. And I know, Jacqueline, you had another question kind of about that magic age, right? Which I think is very cool with middle grade.
Well, especially since this is kind of your, as you said, the first thing you've written for younger readers. The twins' 11th birthday is kind of this moment where a bunch of the rest of the plot gets moving along. It's where their serious introduction to root work begins. It's where everything sort of starts to move forward. Why do you think 11 is so often the magic age in stories?
I find that a lot of middle grade, especially once it gets to be sort of adventure focused middle grade, it's around that age, obviously depending on your family and where you live and all of that good stuff. But at the time, it was the age where you were sort of turned out to the world after school and not expected home for a certain amount of time. And you had that sort of freedom. And it's that age where you tend to feel like you're becoming your own person and you're making all your own judgments. Not all of them, but you're able to make some of your own judgments, and you're learning to filter things through your own personal lens instead of whoever your adults are. And you're given that freedom to sort of explore the world and form ideas. And I think that's sort of where a lot of middle grade comes in and picks up 11-year-olds, a little older 10-year-olds, more mature 10-year-olds, if you want to use that phrasing. It's where you just sort of begin your own personal journey. And I think that Jez and Jay sort of have each other to bounce ideas off of as well before they go to adults about things. So it's where they're sort of starting to use their own rationale a lot instead of immediately going to adults with problems. And that's that sort of, maybe we can figure this out ourselves. And then if it becomes too big, then obviously, you rope in someone else to help sort it out.
I love that. It's so true about siblings, like that being the first person you can kind of turn to. And in this case, that they're exactly the same age. They are each other's peers in this really special way. Yeah, where they're such equals. So speaking of them being twins, there's a lot of sort of duality play, a lot of use of doubles and pairings in the story. There's the good doll, the one that's made by her grandmother, and that is this really protective little figure, and then the really terrifying one, the puppet that she finds later in the swamp. And there's both kind and malicious ghosts. There's one police officer who's a nightmare and another who's sort of trying to be helpful. And I wondered if that's why you decided to have your main characters be twins as well. Was that a conscious choice, or was there another reason for the twins?
Well, I think that I wanted the characters, I wanted them to have someone their own age to bounce those ideas off of. There's a lot of me in Jez, and I didn't grow up with a sibling. So I just wanted to give Jez a sibling because I wanted them to have each other to sort of face whatever else was out there. But as far as the duality of things, I just wanted to present in a story for kids a little bit of gray area, because at times younger fiction tends to be very concrete with this one is bad and this thing is good and this character is good and this character is bad. And I think that it's a good idea for kids early on to start learning that a lot of people have good and bad in them, or they interact different ways with different people. And I think it's a good idea for kids to start sort of seeing that happen so they can realize that, well, not everything is so clear cut all the time, and just give them a chance to start sort of thinking and making their own decisions about people. Because a lot of times you're looking at how Jez and Jay come to root work differently, and the way Jez is treated for doing it versus the way Jay is treated for doing it. They're learning the same thing from the same person, but people on the outside are treating them differently. And I think it's important for kids to realize that that can happen. And how do they respond to it? And how do they react to it?
Yeah, I love that. I love the gray area and playing with things that people traditionally think of as maybe evil, like the dolls are typically the evil dolls in children's fiction. But I love that her doll has an entirely different relationship with her, and it becomes this confidant for her and helper. That's so cool. Yeah, that is awesome. I know Adriana too has been dying to get in here, and I want to let her in here and let her ask some questions. So let me turn it over to you, Adriana.
So I had my first book underwent a title change, and I'm horrible at titles, so having to do that, like not come up with just one title, but more than one, was borderline excruciating. But I know that Root Magic originally was not Root Magic. It was Tying the Devil's Shoestrings, which is actually a really awesome title. That's pretty cool. And so I'm wondering though, like what brought about the change? Why did it undergo that title change? And like, what did you kind of experience in the editorial process of this book that maybe was different than what you had experienced before?
Well, let me start with the editorial part. Because the book was significantly longer than anything else that I'd written, the amount of edits was the biggest change. So I had lots of edits, different rounds of edits, and then copy edits, line edits, all of that sort of good stuff, which I knew I was getting. I knew I was getting those. It was my first book. I had never structured a novel before. I had never plotted one or put one together, as I mentioned earlier. So I didn't know how to do it correctly. So I went into it knowing that there would be things asked of me to change or explain or put somewhere else. This is a good scene, but it needs to come in a different place in the book, or whatever have you. So that was the biggest editorial change, because most of my short stories, even though they have had minor edits, they have been maybe word choice or word selection or asking for a sentence or two here to clarify something for the reader or whatever have you. So I think just the sheer length of them and the sheer amount of edits was probably the biggest change for me. But I completely embraced it because I knew this was just a way of learning how to tackle the novel format. As far as other things besides structural and developmental edits, there were a lot of, and I think I alluded to this earlier, there were a lot of things just having to do with Blackness and Black Southernness specifically that were questions during the editing process, because no one in the editorial process was a Black Southerner. So there were lots of questions about, is this what you mean to say? Have you left a word out here? Should you explain why it's, November and the kids are outside, but they're not wearing coats? And I said, well, because the low country of South Carolina has almost a subtropical climate and they don't need coats. So, when you're interacting with someone that hasn't been to the part of the world that you're from and doesn't know the people that there's a lot of questions because it's sort of filtered through their personal lens. So there's lots of questions like, well, why aren't they afraid of this? Well, this is a cultural thing. This is something that they've grown up doing and grown up hearing about. So it isn't something that's unusual or frightening to them. So it was a lot of making decisions on, do I clarify this? Do I make the change? Or do I stead it because this is exactly what I wanted to say? And it's authentic to the book. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of steading going on.
Did you feel any pressure that, since, like you said, your copy editors and your editorial board per se weren't coming from the same background as you, were you pressured at all to have to explain things in your book rather than just present them? And then I'm also wondering about your characters when they're speaking. They have their own dialect, and a lot of times dialect gets copy edited. And so I'm wondering if you had to push back against that as well.
I'm already sort of chuckling about it. I was told very early on in the process that they did exactly that they edited out dialect. And they had reasonings for it, but which I understood. But I said, after I heard that, I thought, root magic doesn't work without the language. It doesn't work without the dialect. And I thought about that and I thought, how am I going to approach this with an editor who has this stipulation, for my book that we can't have dialect and we have to find a different way of getting things across, versus can I just say, are you sure about that? And how much can I push back? Because you're very new to the experience and you don't always know, what can I say? How can I disagree professionally and still maintain a relationship, because the worry being a brand new author is, am I going to do something wrong? Am I going to say something wrong? Is this book deal going to somehow evaporate in front of me? So you're coming to the table with these sort of just under the surface concerns, and you really have to sort of think, well, how do I have a difficult conversation? But thankfully for me, my editor went on his own and educated himself about Gullah and Geechee language and why it's important to preserve it. And he came back to me and he said, we want this book to be the book that you want it to be. So let's just do the dialect. He said, if I feel like there's some sort of barrier to understanding, then I can note that. But we want you to have the ability to make this book the thing that you want it to be. So I was very lucky in that. And I know that a lot of authors don't get that opportunity. They have to finally find a way to navigate that super difficult space of saying, hey, I kind of don't want to change that. Is that a deal breaker? So I was super lucky in that respect. But I think you do feel a bit of concern with not only, it's coming at you from all these angles. It's coming at you from your editorial team. It's coming at you from, am I portraying my culture the right way? Am I watering it down, for, mass consumption? So there's a lot of things that you're experiencing on top of, oh my gosh, I've just written a book. Oh my gosh, I've just gotten a book deal. Oh my gosh, there's so many levels and layers that you have to navigate. And it is a challenge to do. It's super rewarding. But while you're in it, there's a lot of worry, I guess, for lack of a better word. And on top of traditional publishing moving a bit slowly sometimes, and you're sitting there with, your email open and you're wanting a response for this and you're checking to see when you sent it and how long has it been since you sent it, double checking the email address. Did I send it to the right email address? Am I sure? Okay, I'm sure that they're working on it. Do I nudge them? So there's just all these things that you're sort of sitting with as you're trying to sort of push forward. And I found that the best thing to do is to immerse yourself in a new project. Just whether it's starting the research for one, or starting the planning for one, or starting the writing, because it's the only thing that's going to keep you from worrying about what's going on that you can't affect and you can't have any sort of control over. And there's a lot of that with publishing.
Yeah, I feel that immensely. A lot of times when we do school visits, kids will ask us, what's the most difficult part of the writing or publishing process? And I always say it's the waiting. But you and I have the same coping strategy. You just have to jump into something else. Or like you said, you'll drive yourself mad clicking that refresh button on your email.
Absolutely. Just find the next shiny project and completely immerse yourself into getting that done.
Yep. But I'll say, I asked you a massively loaded question. So I do want to know, though, about the title change of why are we not talking about tying the devil's shoestrings? Why is that not on our book?
I actually love the title as well. And I thought that it fit the story at the time. And when I wrote it as a bunch of these individual short stories, there was several items of root work that were used throughout. But obviously, the name of that particular root is an ear-catching one, for lack of a better way of putting that out there. But I think that anytime you use the word devil in something, I think people have this connotation that pops up for them individually. And because of the history of root work in a lot of African traditional religions, people seeing them as evil in and of themselves, we wanted to stay away from that title because there is this unfortunate popular media culture portraying those religions as evil and the people that practice them as evil. You know, if you just pull up any horror movie from almost from the 1930s up until today, conjure magic and root work and voodoo and Santeria, all of those tend to be portrayed in such a negative light, and they're very rarely portrayed from the point of view of the practitioners. So we wanted to stay away from that title and and root magic was, I think, a more all-encompassing title because it talked more about the process of learning um, root work and everything that goes into it. So it's also about navigating how other people respond to you. It's about doing things side by side, learning uh, school learning and technology alongside tradition. So it's a lot of things sort of wrapped up in one. So we thought that root magic was a more all encompassing term to give the book. And I think it works.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because I mean, you even do, I think, a phenomenal job of portraying the perceptions that people have of root work and root magic in the story of just the different opinions that Jez's family faces. So I think you almost portray right there in the story the why you had to change the title. So that makes perfect sense. As we were kind of saying before of how we cope with this whole publishing world and whatnot, there are always a lot of students and then not students, older adults that are interested in publishing, interested in writing, and are always asking us for advice. So if you had any advice for aspiring writers, what would you kind of say to them?
Oh gosh, I think
Simple
only
question.
just a few things. You know, I think one of the biggest things is to be patient. As we said, publishing takes a lot of time sometimes, and as creative people, we've put our work in front of other eyes, and it's a nerve-wracking place to be. You've sort of put your heart onto the page, so to speak, and you're waiting for someone's feedback, and it's a difficult place to be. So I think being patient, being kind to yourself while you're waiting, and especially when say you've received a rejection, you know, realizing that that isn't a rejection of you, and it isn't a rejection of the fact that you want to be a creative, and it's not saying that you can't be or that you aren't or that you're not good. That just that story or that book just doesn't work for that particular person at that particular time. And there are a myriad of reasons that things can be rejected. And it isn't necessarily that you're not good at what you do. It could be that they've accepted something that's got similar themes. It could be that it's super, super close, but not just quite there yet. It could be that your book came to someone that, let's be honest, has a bias against it. They read it and they just go, I'm not into fantasy that much, or I hate this particular trope that you've used in the book. And they just go, no, not for me. And those are things that, again, you don't have control over. So, sort of being patient with yourself, being kind to yourself in this process, and realizing that if you decide, especially to do traditional publishing, there's going to be a lot of situations where you don't have any eventual effect on the outcome. So if you're a super controlled person and you want to have control over every aspect, this is not the thing to do. Absolutely write your stories, but self-publish them. Use your own judgment with cover and formatting and editing and all of that good stuff and get your work out there. But distract yourself or learn patience, one of the two, or a combination of both. Sometimes it's a combination of both that gets you through.
I absolutely love that. I'm like raising my hand when you say control like freak, but you know, and also like it's so funny because I think a lot of my author friends know like I'm very seriously looking into hybrid publishing because I'm a fast writer and the control situation and the talk about editorial control too. And I was really that was actually the question I forgot that I was going to bring up was that man as a debut author, knowing yourself and like your vision for the book well enough to be able to stand up for your vision in that situation with a power dynamic. Like, I think that is, if you can do that with your first novel, that is amazing. And so, I mean, partly I'm wondering, like, did you have a group of authors, like a peer network, like people that you were able to turn to for support and be like, what can I do in this situation? And people that were able to kind of give you feedback like that and be like, no, it's okay. You can stand up for your vision in this moment, you know?
I did have people that did that. My husband is a wonderful sounding board for things like that. I do call my mom to vent about things. And she's very good about listening and giving considered feedback, not necessarily on the story itself, but on the issue at hand of this is what they've said that they want me to change. What do you think about it? That sort of thing. So she's there to sympathize and say, for the most part, I trust your judgment. You know, you can do this, think about it, step away from it for a little while if you need to, do something else, come back to it. So I did have people to give me that feedback. I have a couple of writers that I can go to or shoot a quick email off to say, am I coming at this sort of the right way? Have I portrayed this? Does this feel clear to you? And is this sort of a I'm not a Southerner kind of thing that I just need to say, you should just go with this because this is the reality of how this part of the world functions. So I think it's important to have that, especially when you're writing about a specific part of the world or a specific group of people. It's important to have that sounding board. Obviously, if you're writing something where you're doing your own complete world building and character craft, and you just want to wait until it's over and have somebody read it at the end, that's fine. But going through that editorial process, I think it's important to have someone that you can say, I need you to be completely honest with me about this particular thing, and be able to take that honest feedback on board. And that's, I think, the role of the author is to embrace that honest feedback. So if you have someone that's kind enough to read your work and give you honest feedback, you need to be open enough to receive it and realize that sometimes you have to sort of pick through all those comments and find out what works and what doesn't. And I think that new writers sometimes they think, I'm not going to be able to deal with criticism, of my work. And I think that a lot of times the way to handle that or the way to start getting used to receiving criticism is to only ask it of people that you have a certain trusting relationship with, people that have either never read your work or don't know you at all. Those aren't necessarily the people to start asking for feedback from. It's someone that knows your intentions, somebody that knows either not necessarily how you write, but knows you as a person, who knows your drive and your desire to write, who will be able to say, okay, I'll read it and give you feedback. And then even if you have to sit it aside for a day or two before you read it, even if you read it through once and you have to sit it aside before you respond to it, it is something that is a relationship between your alpha or beta readers or your critiquers. you have, they've given their time to you to read your work. They could have been doing anything else, but they've taken the time to actually read something and think about it and respond. And I think that's something to recognize. And it's a very valuable thing to have as someone that will be honest about your work so that you can make whatever changes might be necessary.
Absolutely. Especially, I always have to let it sit. Sometimes it's for like a week for me. Like, when I get especially a big editorial letter, maybe it's like multiple pages long. Oh boy, there's some processing time that comes with that.
Absolutely.
Whew, man. So you had brought up indie publishing. Is that something that you're also considering as an outlet for your work or different types of works? Or where do you see yourself going in the future? Like, what can we expect from Eden Royce going forward?
Well, I will go backwards first because my first two collections of short stories I self-published. I have, it's Spooklight Southern Gothic Horror, books 1 and 2. I self-published both of those because I'd written all of these short stories, and at various times I tried to get them published. I sent them to magazines and anthology calls for submissions. Some of them were form rejections, some of them were personalized rejections, but at the end of the day, they were all rejections. And I felt like the stories were where I wanted them to be. And like I mentioned earlier, people reject things for a number of reasons. It isn't because you're necessarily a bad writer. Sometimes they just don't understand. And I realized at the time that a lot of these people that were editing these magazines, they were not from the part of the world that I was from. So they didn't really understand what I was getting at with a lot of the themes and topics. So I ended up getting rejections. And I decided these stories are where I want them. So I put them together, wrote an intro, contacted someone about cover art, just sort of educated myself on how to do the self-publishing thing and put the stories in order as best I could, and sort of held my breath as I hit the publishing button and then closed the computer and went away for a while because it was too much. I'd done all this work and I was just tossing it out there, without any sort of safety net, because a lot of times when you see a book's been published, there's a certain amount of understanding from a reader that this book has obviously gone through several chains of command. It's gone through several levels. Multiple eyes have been on it. So you expect, even if you don't love the book, you expect a certain amount of polish on the book. And doing it all yourself, it can also be a scary thing. So I have done the self-publishing thing. I've had work with small presses. And I think traditional publishing for me was just sort of the next thing to try. It was that sort of, well, I've done these other things. Let's see what traditional publishing is like. So as far as for the future, for me, I have a second middle grade that is with my editor now that I'm assuming, get feedback and edits from sometime shortly. And I have written up some ideas for a third middle grade. And we will see how that goes.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I love this idea of trying all of the different avenues. I think that's so smart. Like, you never know what an avenue is going to be like until you try it. And it's great to have all of those different things open to you at any different time. And they are just very different audiences too. And I think it's really important. It's really cool how indie publishing has evolved over the past decade and become this really awesome way to get things directly to readers without having to go through all of the levels of gatekeepers. And the fact that that has become a super viable option now is awesome. And I love that that's out there and want to try it myself. So inspired by that story. Very cool. We are so thrilled that you were able to join us. And I'll check in with Jacqueline and Adrienne to see if you have any last minute burning questions that we didn't get to. Jacqueline or Adrienne, either one.
It would just be me continuing to gush about the books because I absolutely loved it and I can't wait to read. Like when you were talking about your subsequent middle grade manuscripts that you have planned, my impatient side came out. I was like, okay, when? Because I would like them now, please.
I know.
So I can't wait to read more Eden Royce in the future.
I am so thrilled to hear that. Thank you so much. And this was just such an amazing experience, and just to hear the love for root magic is a wonderful thing for a book that I think people didn't feel would sort of find an audience outside of the American South. It's been so warmly received, and I'm just super grateful and super pleased. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. We are so thrilled. It was stunning and immersive and haunting and beautifully written. And it was just such a joy to read. And we're so happy that you're able to join us. And I will be putting links in the description to the various things that we mentioned today. But is there any final thing, Eden, that you want to tell people about or that people should check out from you, or where people can find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Eden Royce. You can find me on Instagram at Eden Royce Books. I'm still learning to navigate Instagram. I'm not super great with it, but I'm trying. I actually took a screenshot and shared it on Instagram yesterday for the first time, and it was a huge milestone for me. And I have a website, which is edenroyce.com. And I'm usually on one of those 3 places. As far as any last words, just enjoy root magic until the next one comes out, whenever that is.
Thank you so much. We are all waiting and excited. And thanks to everyone who was able to join live today. And we also have another book club live that is coming up next month. And drum roll, please. It's one of my books. So don't laugh. I won't be hosting. Samantha M. Clark will be joining us, author of The Boy, the Boat, and the Beast. And she will be hosting next month's book club live. So I hope everyone will also be able to join us next week. Thanks to Eden, Jacqueline, and Adriana. And thanks to you all. Have a great afternoon, everyone.